Every club. Every day. The Global Sports Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to Beyond the Pitch, a daily women's football podcast brought to you by the Global Sports Podcast Network. Today, we bring you our fifth episode of the Hidden Game series. It's brought to you by myself, Briony, and my co-host, Raj. How are we doing?
Hello all. Yeah, very well. Thank you. Yourself?
Yeah, good. Thank you. We are, in fact, joined today by special guest David Goldblatt. Would you like to introduce yourself? Really excited to have you here today.
Well, thanks very much for having me. Excited to be here. I'm a football historian and a football writer. Thank
you for coming on. Obviously, you've spent more time than us kind of uncovering these untold stories of the football history and done a little bit of work on around the Copa 71, and it'd be interesting to speak to bring to light the tournament and how it was buried for the decades it has been, kind of thing. And in this episode specifically, we will explore the historical ban on women's football, the stories behind the documentary, and how the media narratives have shaped the women's game, both then and in comparison to now. So we'll move straight to you first, David. So myself and Raj recently, we were having this conversation around the spark of the ban initially on women's football in 1921, and we were interested to hear from you. Can you clarify for us, there was the ban in 21, and then there was where was the line in terms of women then being able to go on and play in Copa and train back on was or wasn't it affiliated football grounds?
So I think there's a certain amount of misunderstanding around the concept of the ban, and some people hear that and think women are somehow not allowed to play football, and the Football Association, powerful and sovereign as it might be, doesn't actually have the power to stop women playing football. But what it did have the power to do was to say to affiliated football clubs, so clubs that were members of the Football Association, you are not allowed to allow women to play on your pitches, nor are you allowed to have a women's team or to play in any sense a women's team. So that given that the vast majority of football coaching, football facilities and football pitches were in the hands of FA affiliated clubs, it effectively excludes women from playing football in an organised fashion. So after 1921, women still played football, but they're playing in the margins. They're playing on kind of heathland. They're playing at the edge of the park. They're playing in municipal spaces, but without access to any of the organisation or coaching or facilities that membership of the Football Association would bring. I mean, you do have a case in some countries further down the line where women really are banned from playing football. So in Brazil, for example, in the 1930s, women playing football is actually made a criminal offence. So we're not just in the realm of saying you can't play on my pitch. We're saying if you play football, then you're breaking the law. So that's a much more serious ban. That's actually really what a ban looks like. And the same was true in Italy under Mussolini's dictatorship in the late 1920s and early 1930s. So women carried on playing football, but they are excluded from what is now an exclusively masculine world of organised football.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Have you got anything to add, Raj?
Yeah, so that absolutely kind of clarifies our understanding of the ban, because we were under the impression that it was more of a how Brazil and Italy done it, but it was literally just kind of the FA trying to enforce their kind of dominance and saying, you can't do this, but actually you're not going to be criminalised for it. You just can't use our official pitches. But to my understanding, there were some rugby clubs that allowed the women to use the pitches. Is that correct?
Not that I've heard of, but, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, rugby...
That was a big kind of mystery how they would have been banned and then got to Copa in 71 kind of thing. So in preparation for this World Cup, that's what they were doing, playing in parks, just playing anywhere they could, basically. And then how did it I know obviously it was the Mexican Association that said, look, we can make some money out of this. Let's put this tournament on, kind of thing. How did the teams get invited? How did the tournament come about?
Well, actually, the Mexican Football Federation wasn't involved and was expressly told not to be involved by FIFA. The people who made the tournament happen were the giant telecommunications company, Televisia, who were the dominant hegemonic TV, radio, newspaper group in Mexico in the 1960s and 1970s. And they owned the Azteca Stadium and the Estadio Jalisco in Guadalajara. And therefore, they were able to, they didn't have to worry about what the Mexican Football Federation said or not, because it was their stadiums. And the stadium, both of them had been used successfully at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, and had also staged many games at the Men's World Cup in 1970. And Televisia thought, we've got these great big stadiums. We haven't got much else going on in them over the outside of the men's football season. Why don't we have a women's football tournament? And they thought, with great, they were just so ahead of the curve. They thought, I think there's something in this. There was a small Mexican women's football scene. They could see that there were small scenes elsewhere. Why don't we put on a Women's World Cup? So it was, it came out, it was a commercial operation, and there was nothing that FIFA or the Mexican Football Federation could do about it. I mean, at that time, Televisia, literally the government aside, is the most powerful institution in Mexico. So what Televisia says goes.
Right. Interesting. So is it like equivalent to BBC here?
No, because it's not a state corporation in any way. It was a private corporation founded by the Azcárraga family. But it had very, very close links to the ruling PRI, who the political party who'd been running Mexico for the previous 60 or 70 years. So it was very, very closely linked to the people who actually ran Mexico.
Hence, they could do whatever they wanted, essentially.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Okay.
It's really interesting, actually. And I mean, for you, David, in terms of, if we go more onto the recording, the filming of the documentary, what would you say stood out to you most from your time producing and putting together that?
Well, I mean, I should say, I didn't really put it together. I'm just a talking head.
Yeah.
I was interviewed by James Erskine, who was, the director. What occurred to me, the first thing was seeing the footage for the first time and giving praise and thanks that Televisia kept all the film. I mean, so much stuff like this, the film gets lost. I mean, I've recently been researching a football soap opera that the BBC ran in the mid-1960s to try and get some of Coronation Street's audience. It was called United, and it ran for 2 years, and it was like 140 episodes, and not a single episode has survived because the BBC used to just chuck the tape away or like record something else over it because they were short of tape. But Televisia have a fabulous film library. So they had an incredible collection, of course, all of the games, but all of the news footage, all of the promotional footage that they shot. And they're a serious television company. I mean, in some ways, in terms of staging television spectacles, way ahead of the BBC or European television. So I was really blown away by just like how much they kept and how grateful I was that they'd kept it. I was really struck, perhaps you were when you watched it, by the incredible colour palette of the film at the time. It's almost sort of like Technicolor with incredibly deep tones of sort of red against really bleached out, intense Mexican sunshine. And I thought that was just looked really amazing. And I was struck by how much time, how much effort, how much money Televisia put into promoting the event. You know, they didn't just invite people and put it on. It's like, we are going to fill the Azteca. And, you know, there was all of the ancillary stuff that you have around any football tournament. You know, the posters, you know, the interviews with players on the news, you know, all the background stories, you know, checking in with the training camp, interviews with the fans, all of that stuff. You know, they did absolutely brilliantly. I mean, better, I would say, than any Women's World Cup until we get to sort of literally 2011, 2015. I mean, they're 40 years ahead of everybody else. And I thought they struck a pretty good tone, given that it's Mexico in 1971. You know, the focus is on the women as players. You know, they're not being treated as kind of, you know, dolly birds. They're being treated as serious athletes. And the language that's used and the format that's used, it's all very close to the way in which men's football would have been covered in Mexico at the time. So I thought that was really interesting. The crowds. Oh my God. It's 1971, you know, and there's 120,000 people in the Azteca, you know, to see Mexican women play, you know, Italy. I mean, that's just amazing. That's just, nothing has topped it since, you know. Everybody's going mad because Barcelona can get, you know, 89,000 in the new camp, or, you know, Arsenal women playing at 61,000 at the Emirates. And that's great, you know, of course. But how incredible that in 1971 that should happen. It just does make one think, oh boy, 40 wasted years. Like, there was the potential, you know. What were FIFA and everybody else thinking? Like, you see that, you don't think, oh, maybe we should do something. So I was really, really struck by that.
Honestly, that's so interesting that you say that, because one of the first things that popped into my head when watching the documentary was the attendance, the crowd attendance. And just before I watched it, I'd been to Lionesses versus USA at Wembley, which they kept making a point of saying sellout crowd, biggest crowd ever. And I think it was something like 89,000. And immediately I was like, well, it's not, is it? It's not the biggest crowd ever we've had in women's football, because we've got this documentary here which showing they filled an even bigger stadium. And it's bittersweet, because I can't help to feel, like you just said, 40 wasted years. If I had seen that as a child, it would have been so much more normalised that women's football is as big as men's football, and women in the 70s are playing football and being treated as athletes. And we've seen the training camps, and growing up, I could have thought, do you know what? This is possible. But because there was absolutely none of that until the late 90s when the USA done it, do you think that, well, you've kind of just said it really, 40 wasted years. Do you think football, women's football, would be in a more progressive place now had we have had access to that footage earlier?
Of course. I mean, you know, plenty of other stuff would have had to have happened as well, you know, to really bring change about, because the scale of opposition and misogyny in the institutions of football was so huge. But yeah, it's a huge loss, you know, and it remains the case that FIFA still don't actually acknowledge that this is the first Women's World Cup, you know, and therefore all the records that everybody has discount it. I mean, I'm inclined to think, oh, well, you know, don't. We all now know about it, and it's a great big fuck you every time you come up with some record or another, and we're all going, yeah, but what about Mexico 71? So, yeah. You know, James, and I should also say Racial Doctors, who was the co-producer with James of it, have just done us all a gigantic service by putting it out there. And it's good. Be a thorn. It's like a thorn in FIFA's side. Like, remember, this is what you screwed up. This is what you didn't want to support. This is what you suppressed and hid. Ha!
Exactly. And do you think they have any regret of not getting there first?
Well, the people who were like in charge of FIFA at the time are all dead. Bless Sir Stanley Rouse, he's long gone. And Joao Havelange, who soon followed afterwards, although somehow he made it to 100, is also dead. I mean, I don't know. Does FIFA have regrets? That's not the style of the institution. That will, assume a degree of critical self-reflection and humility that FIFA, as far as I can see, does not possess. So the short answer to your question is no.
No.
Just to touch bases on that then, in terms of the documentary, did you personally get to have interactions with or filming moments with the players who were given reflections of their experiences, or was that not something you got around to doing?
Well, I mean, it's just not available. I'm just a talking head. That's all James's business. I mean, I was teaching in the United States at the time at a liberal arts college, and he came over to film me and just came and filmed me one afternoon in the big lecture theatre, and that's my whole involvement.
Wow.
That's really interesting.
And when you heard the accounts of the players, when you watched the documentary back and you heard kind of what they had to go through, and then so they had the hype of being involved and being advertised and playing in the matches, etc. And then the aftermath of it, did that surprise you that they'd had the confidence to kind of go in there, play, be part of it, and they'd felt that high of being part of it, but it seems like no one really fought to continue it or to grow the game after that, and it just dropped off and they kind of never spoke to each other again.
So I think, there are lots and lots of great stories of the players, and the directors did an amazing job to track everybody down and allow them their voice. But two really stand out for me. First of all, the Italian striker, Elena Scevo, I think you pronounce her surname. She is proof positive that women's football, would have been a gigantic hit if people had got on the case. What a player, what a character, what energy, what charisma, demonic intensity. I mean, just what an incredible woman, an incredible player. I mean, she would have been a superstar. If she was playing today, she would be never mind Marta, she would be the superstar of women's football. I mean, in a way, there are lots of great players and characters out there, but boy, could we do with her out there right now. So she just blew me away. I absolutely loved her. And I just think it's an indication of the tragedy of the situation that she came home. And Italy, was a bit more organised and a bit more together and less dismissive than England. But, she's consigned to, not even semi-amateur, just amateur football after the high. The other story that really struck me was Carol Wilson, who's the youngest of the England team from the Northeast. And wow, imagine being 16 or 17 or whatever it is, and you've literally never left the country, and suddenly you're at the Azteca playing for England in front of 120,000 people. I mean, what a high. And that again makes the low on her return so sad. Not merely to be forgotten, which is the fate of all of the women players, but as you'll remember, she and her father are invited to a charity dinner held by Newcastle United, who should, to this day, hang their heads in shame. And they invite her to this charity dinner, and she thinks that she's going to be celebrated, and the compere takes the piss out of her in front of everybody. And she never speaks of the time again until James finds her and interviews her. 40 years more of silence. I mean, I just, it's the movie. I'm sure you felt something of this. It's on the one hand, it's, so inspirational and so amazing, but boy, it makes you angry.
Yeah.
And her story above all, I think, that's what really stands out for me. The cruelty to do that to a 17-year-old. And the disdain and the contempt in which women's football is held by the male football institutions in the 1970s. Man, that makes me cross.
So to build on that point, would you say there was any in particular perspectives from these players that maybe changed your view on women's football at all?
I think Schiavo from Italy changed it in just like recognizing, I don't know if I know of any woman footballer to this day who displays the demonic intensity of that woman on and off the pitch. So I think that's something everybody needs to check in with, and everybody who has any doubts about the competitive quality of women's football seriously needs to check in with her. So I think that reinforced something that I felt. Again, it was, I suppose I was surprised that Mexico had such a big women's football scene in 1971. That was like news to me. I knew the Italians had a thing going. I knew that there was a thing going on in England. But yeah, who knew from like Argentina, women's football, 1971? That was news to me. So a sense that women's football still effectively underground, was a more global phenomena in 1971 than I had hitherto imagined.
I think it's really interesting as well from the perspective of, like you were saying a moment ago about it is inspirational, but, there's that anger that comes with it, wherein I think for me, it was watching the documentary and they talk about the England players, how they got off the plane, they got back here and there was no one here and they didn't speak about it again. They didn't speak to each other again until they come back together and they were filmed at a Lioness game. And for me, that was the saddest part about it, was that they'd gone out and experienced such a groundbreaking moment in history together as a team. And then they went on not to speak for another 40 years after it.
Yeah, really sad, because that's a collective experience, and you forge bonds with people under those circumstances that are kind of lifelong and intense and super meaningful. So, yeah, tragedy piled upon tragedy, injustice upon injustice.
While we're on the subject of tragedy, one thing that really stood out for me was initially the reasons as to why women's football was banned in the first place. So for something along the lines of women's having wombs and not being correct structure to play football. And then there was one of the players, Sharon, I think it was, being interviewed, and the man interviewing her just outright says to her, "What's a lovely girl like you, Sharon, playing a sport like football?" And to which she replies, "Why? What's wrong with football?" And he just kind of says, "Well, don't you want to be playing netball or hockey or something like that?" And that just really stood out for me, because even today, when we look at social media and we'll have comments under the likes of Ella Toone, Bunny Shaw, all of these kind of top players, Chloe Kelly, she can't kick a ball, she needs to get back in the kitchen. Or doesn't she just want to play netball? Football's a man's game. And although we've made all this progression, I couldn't help to watch the documentary and just feel like we're still in the same place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, we're not in the same place, but we are also still, as a society, shaped by attitudes and beliefs and assumptions that are now, I mean, they've been around, since the 1860s, and rewiring the culture and rewiring, in particular, men in English football. Like, did anyone think that was going to take place overnight? Like, look what you're dealing with. So I would, on the one hand, of course, it's like completely unbelievable that this kind of bullshit is still going on. And yet, on the other hand, it's like entirely explicable. I mean, football is invented, and its earliest culture is created in all male institutions. English football, as we play it, is invented and codified by English public schools in the mid-19th century. And it is part of a wider cultural and educational project to shape a particular version of upper-class English masculinity. The job of the public schools, as they understand it in the mid-19th century, is to train a male elite that is equipped to rule the empire. And that requires a kind of disciplined, masculine warrior. And so women are completely excluded from that. In the 19th century, the idea that women could fulfill that function, socially, politically, and athletically, is completely and utterly implausible. And when that culture and that social class are displaced in football, which they are to a great extent from the 1870s, when working class men and boys start playing football, we have a shift of class, but attitudes on gender are no different. Football becomes a place where you can valorize not merely a kind of upper class version of warrior masculinity, but now also a particular version of working class, industrial, tough masculinity as well. So the entire game is completely suffused from its very, very beginning with those conceptions of what football is, what a football player is. And that's why it's so threatening when women start playing in the 1890s and then during the First World War. And of course, no surprise. I mean, as I've always argued, the moment women anywhere get the opportunity to play football, they're just like boys and men. It's like they can't believe it. What, there was life before football? This is great. I want to play. Get me on the pitch. Football fever. And that's what's going on, during the First World War, when that generation, above all of working class women, get the opportunity for the first time to kick the ball around. So it runs very deep. And then, you have this extraordinary flowering between 1916 and 1921, when women above all working in factories with access to works football, and in an era where Victorian and Edwardian gender roles and gender ideology is disrupted by the demands of the war, then the ban comes. And it's another 50 years of excluding women. And it becomes, football is this, super duper masculine world. And there are very few places, I would say, in kind of mid-century Britain, with the exception, the army's like that, the church is like that, and public schools are like that. And football is it's the last great act of gender segregation in British society to exclude women from football. So it goes very, very, very deep. Football is a space in which certain kinds of masculinity are performed and celebrated. And when you've not seen anything else, you don't know anything else, and no one is coming along and going, really? Which is what football was for 100 years. No surprise that kind of misogyny, doesn't merely linger, but is kind of alive and well like a poisonous bacteria in the body of the football nation. I mean, you know, there's plenty of it there outside football. Let's not kid ourselves. It's like not like football is the only space in British society where these kinds of attitudes are being expressed. But it has because of this history, there's a whole kind of language of lazy critique and insult that is instantly available to any internet troll who wants to use it. So no surprise that it's out there.
I mean, kind of just to tie into it, I think we've covered a lot of it already on this podcast. We are unfortunately coming to the end of time on this one, but what would you say would be your top 1 or 2 takeaways from Copa as a whole of the tournament and the messages a documentary conveyed are that we need to continue to take forward and build upon in order to continue to see the growth of the women's game as it's going?
I suppose the thing that I would, if it's a lesson, I don't know, it's an observation, is that football, we love to play football. It's a great game. But what makes it the social and political and cultural phenomena that it is its capacity to generate and tell stories, to turn the everyday into the heroic, to make the quotidian mythical. That's what takes it from being just a game into this whole other thing that it is now. And the women's football has been denied that in many ways, you know, because to do that, you have to have a whole body of people writing and thinking and engaging and turning the raw material of athletic performance into heroic narrative, because that's what stays in the mind. That's what really shapes the culture. And I thought Copa Night 71 showed just the unbelievable potency of women's football for mythic, heroic, transformatory stories. It just had that in spades. And, you know, there were so many great twists and turns to every game. And, you know, I love the fact that the Mexicans, basically, you've got a bent referee making sure that Mexico makes the final. But that's the kind of story that makes men's football, like, we all love it. It's one of those things, as the cliche goes, we all hate to see that. But actually, we all love to see that. That's exactly what we want to see. You know, again, it's like there are some moments, you know, when tempers seriously fray on the pitch. And again, I like that about it. It's like people really, really give a damn. You know, women's football treads a complicated path. It doesn't want to be the men's game. Doesn't want to replicate a lot of its toxic masculinity. But it also, you know, football is a game that demands a certain level of aggression. You know, that's the nature of the game. It's a contact sport played at high speed in which emotions are, for both participants and spectators, are unnaturally raised, which is why it's such a buzz. And I thought it was just great to see that dimension of the game, particularly in the Mexico-Italy game, but not only in that. And I thought, you know, let's not sanitize things too much was my feeling, you know, because that's the rough edges of football is part of what makes it, you know, the global game, why we can't get enough of it. So I took both of those. I suppose those were my sort of big takeaways. And I suppose the third thing is, you know, Televisia showed everybody 50 years ago now, like, put some money in your best journalists and your editorial energy into making it a show, and people will come and they will make stories out of it. So yeah, hats off to Televisia, you know, who politically are not my blood brothers, but on this occasion, the boys done well.
Amazing.
And they were boys, I have to say, for all of the progressiveness of Copa 71, you know, the journalistic workforce of Televisia in 1971 looked pretty male to me. And that's the thing, there's a message. I mean, we need more women in the press box. We're talking a lot rightly about, we need more women coaches and we need more women in administrative positions, but we need more women in the press box getting coverage and getting opportunity in the men's game as well as in the women's game.
Amazing. It's been really insightful, actually, to speak to you today. Really appreciate your time. My pleasure. It's lovely to be with you. It was such a great thing to be in Copa 71, I can tell you. It's my, it's pretty much the peak of my broadcasting career, such as it is. That's really interesting.
David, thank you so much to hear your views, and everything on the whole of the documentary has been absolutely fantastic. And I absolutely love and agree with the end bit that you just said, like, don't take the passion out of the women's game, because that's what we play it for. Don't take the passion and the fire out of it. So
don't take the edge. It's passion, but it's like, as well as I do, it's passion with an edge. I mean, just as an example of that, I play in a three-sided walking football group. I know, what a concept, but there it is. And walking football is meant to take all the kind of like toxicity out of football, because you're walking, you can't be running and bashing. But I tell you, everybody still is. We're walking, but we're still absolutely on edge. In our heads, we're all kind of gliding at high speed across, across the pitch at Old Trafford. And football's just got that something about it that just fires all those neurons, even at walking pace.
Do you know what? It's funny you say that, because I was coaching some kids today who I put into walking football just because of the weather conditions, and I still had kids in fights over it. So proves your point.
And so all those kind of slightly overweight 65, 55-year-old gentlemen who are on a weight loss program through, it's the same. I've seen they're having to introduce sin bins into walking football, but I don't see that necessarily as a problem.
No. Brilliant. I have to ask you before we go, David, what football team do you support?
So my first love, inherited from my grandfather and my father, is Tottenham Hotspurs. They're still my Premier League team, and they keep me interested in the commercial circus. But for the last, how long is it now? 22 years, I've been living in Bristol, and I'm about 500 metres from the Memorial Stadium, home of the mighty Bristol Rovers, and the Gas, as they are colloquially referred to. That's the first score that I'm looking for these days. I love it. The only team in world football whose nickname is a state of matter. I just love that. No one else can claim that, right?
Brilliant. And on that note, I think that's a good time to wrap it up. And thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate your time. And it's been fantastic. And I hope everyone enjoys this episode. David, where can we find you on socials if we want to have a look into more of your research?
I've got an account on in Muskland, but like everybody else, I'm kind of I've had enough. So I'm on Blue Sky. You can find me there. I'm on Instagram. You can find me there. Just put in David Goldblatt. You'll find there's a few others, but I'm definitely not the immunologist at UCL, and I'm not the dead, very famous South African photographer of the same name, and I'm not the weird guy in California who can't stop tweeting about the details of computer language on Facebook. So, given that field, you'll work out who I am.
Fantastic. All right, good to know. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, guys. Much appreciated.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. And we will welcome you back to our next episode, where we will wrap up this series next Friday. To see you all then. Thank you very much.